Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in today. And this channel has an educational mission to inform you about great theories, concepts, and discoveries that uh, the powers that be don't want you to know about. And this is a segment we have called Bible Decode, number 513. And this is stuff that your priest, pastor, or pope, even your friends and family, don't want you to look into because it is going to upset everybody's comfort zone. It's going to attack everybody's cherished beliefs about how things are. But, you know, at least in my book, the truth is the highest value. And so that's what we should always be striving for, regardless of how comfortable or uncomfortable it is. And as a result, we have been examining all angles of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. There are at least a dozen books out there right now that argue for the authorship of the New Testament to have been the Roman Caesars. The Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of the late 1st century, who composed the the Gospels as fiction, as a psychological operation against the Jews, who they had just finished fighting in a long war, really over 100-year-long war, skirmishes and revolts and uprisings and revolutions, and then flat-out wars. The Jews were, fancied themselves to be the chosen people, and they had a separate set of rules and regulations that they had to abide by. The Romans, on their part, they believed in freedom of religion for everybody within their empire. But at the same time, they wanted you to give a nod to Caesar. And the Jews would not do that. And so, that was kind of the basis for all of the disputes between the Jews and the Romans. The Jews were of the dozens or even hundreds of nations that were under the Romans' umbrella in the Roman Empire. The Jews were the most difficult people to deal with, most high maintenance. And so they recognized that the Jews were waiting on a Messiah, a Jewish Messiah who was a military commander, who was going to help the Jews, organize the Jews to rise up and overthrow the Romans. And it must be pointed out that that Jewish Messiah, that military commander, was a human being, not a son of God, but a human being. And that the Son of God idea was really anathema to the Jews, and it's strictly a pagan idea, and it really is part of the pagan boilerplate or template or cookie cutter for all pagan myths all over the world, from Krishna to Attis to Osiris, and to even some secular characters like Socrates, Hercules. They all have the same script of, being a son of God, coming down here, imparting wisdom, performing miracles and healings, and then being unjustly accused and executed, and then rising up back to heaven. And so that should be your first clue that something is wrong with your Christian story. Um, and so the Romans created this Christian story um, based on a Jewish Messiah who not only was the Son of God, but was also a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking the extra mile and turning the other cheek and calling the Roman centurion slave owner the greatest faith in all of Israel. And then at the very same time, being utterly critical of the Jews, overturning the tables of the money changers at the outskirts of the temple, uh, criticizing the Jewish merchants selling animals at the temple for the sacrifice, encouraging his Jewish followers to abandon their families to follow him. And this just shows you again, it should be a red flag. Something is wrong. This isn't something that would not happen. There would not be a Jewish, you know, person even who would take the viewpoint of the Romans at the same time as really trying to tear apart the Jews. Another thing that Jesus does, and Paul as well, because Paul fits into this too, um, is that he dilutes and tries to erode the Jewish traditions and rituals, the circumcision, the kosher food laws, the observance of the Sabbath, the stricture against graven images, and even the following of the commandments. All of these things Jesus takes little digs at, does examples in his life where he defies these things and finds a way to justify it. And Paul does it even more. So, again, another red flag. But the real evidence, there's a ton of circumstantial evidence as well. The Romans created a bunch of other religions here at this very same time for propagandistic purposes. The Romans were the only people who had the means, the motive, the method, and the resources to pull off something like this. They were masters of propaganda and psychological operations and enigmas and puzzles and word games and satires and mockeries. And um, you know the bottom line is that the Romans were really the only people who could have done this. They had a monopoly on uh, publishing, distribution, and censorship within the empire. The New Testament is written in Greek. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, as did everybody else in Palestine. Only a few spoke Greek, and uh, only a few of them were literate in Greek. So that is whereas in Rome, everybody spoke Greek. So um, that is another major problem. Now, we're looking at a book that is called Creating Christ by James Valliant and C.W. Fahy. They take all of these facts, but then for them, the clincher is numismatic, meaning archaeological, a coin that Emperor Titus of the Flavian dynasty minted in approximately 80 or 81 AD that features him on the front, and on the back there is an anchor with a fish or a dolphin wrapped around it. And a fairly little known fact among Christians is that the cross did not become the dominant symbol for Christians until approximately 330 or so AD, when Constantine kind of ran an op where he contended that his mother went to Jerusalem and found the actual cross that Jesus hung from. Um, and Up until that time, the primary symbol set for the Christian for the Christians was a fish or a fish and anchor combination. And so the question is, why are the Christians using the exact same symbol as the Roman Empire at the exact same time? Because we've been told that the Christians were being fed to the lions in the Colosseum by the Romans. You know, you would think that they would want to distance themselves from any connotation having to do with the Romans. So that is what kind of began um, their real, okay, we've got to write a book on this. And we are in the second chapter, I believe, and he's going over some of this archaeological evidence, statues and busts and coins and digs, and they're talking about syncretism as well, and they're talking about this concept of Serapis. Serapis was a syncretized god, a god created by the state. In this case, the Ptolemaic state of Egypt, part of the Greek Empire, in about the 3rd century BC. They created Serapis as kind of a combination of several different gods, some Greek gods, some Egyptian gods, and kind of wrapped them together. But the idea is to blend the gods from your people and the conquered people. That way, the conquered people feel like they're having a stake there or whatever, and it pacifies them. And that's this whole idea, is to pacify the Jews, figure out a way that they would accept getting with the program. And now what happens is that the first Flavian emperor, Vespasian, just before he steps onto the throne, he is in Alexandria, Egypt, which is like the second biggest city in the Roman Empire. And he is recorded as performing a few miracles at the temple of Serapis. And it turns out that these miracles are exactly the same as miracles performed by Jesus in the Gospels. So we'll start here. It is interesting that, as we have just done, Tacitus found it necessary to explain the origins of Ptolemy's god Serapis to provide the necessary historical context before describing the miracles of Vespasian. What were these miracles that the future emperor of Rome performed at the temple of Serapis? And so he goes back into quoting Tacitus, the famous Roman historian, from his book Histories, book 4. I believe that's also called Annals. In the months during which Vespasian was waiting at Alexandria for the periodical return of the summer gales and settled weather at sea, many wonders occurred which seemed to point him out as the object of the favor of heaven and of the partiality of the gods. One of the common people of Alexandria, well known for his blindness, threw himself at the emperor's knees and implored him with groans to heal his infirmity. This he did by the advice of the god Serapis, whom this nation, devoted as it is to many superstitions, worships more than any other divinity. He begged Vespasian that he would deign to moisten his cheeks and eyeballs with his spittle. Another, with a diseased hand, at the council of the same god, prayed that the limb might feel the print of a Caesar's foot. At first Vespasian ridiculed and repulsed them. They persisted, and he, though on the one hand He feared the scandal of a fruitless attempt, yet on the other was induced by the entreaties of the men and by the language of his flatterers to hope for success. At last he ordered that the opinion of physicians should be taken as to whether such blindness and infirmity were within the reach of human skill. They discussed the matter from different points of view. In the one case, they said the faculty of sight was not wholly destroyed and might return if the obstacles were removed. In the other case, the limb, which had fallen into a diseased condition, might be restored if a healing influence were applied. Such, perhaps, might be the pleasure of the gods, and the emperor might be chosen to be the minister of the divine will. At any rate, all the glory of a successful remedy would be Caesar's, while the ridicule of failure would fall on the sufferers. And so Vespasian, supposing that all things were possible to his good fortune, and that nothing was any longer past belief, with a joyful countenance, amid the intense expectation of the multitude of bystanders, accomplished what was required. The hand was instantly restored to its use, and the light of day again shone upon the blind. Persons actually present attest both facts, even now when nothing is to be gained by falsehood. And that is the end of that quote. Vespasian's miracles turn out to be exactly the same healing miracles performed by Jesus Christ in the Gospels. Jesus is said to have cured a man with a diseased or withered hand. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is said to have cured a blind man by spitting into his eyes, just like Vespasian. In the Roman historian Suetonius's account of Vespasian's healings at Alexandria, Vespasian cures a lame man by touching him with his heel, and cures a blind man by spitting into his eyes. In this slightly different account, Vespasian is still shown performing miracles identical to those of Jesus Christ in the Gospels, which were again written during the Flavian's reign. Vespasian's biographer Barbara Levick denies that he was a cynical manipulator of religion and was perhaps just a victim of the flattery of others. However, this is obviously contradicted by the facts. For example, when Vespasian captured the priest and rebel general Josephus during the Jewish war, we are told that his Jewish captive predicted he would become emperor. Josephus records that he declared this to Vespasian himself while Nero was still alive. As Levick concedes, this is not credible. The Roman general would have surely executed the man on the spot for saying such a thing, if only to protect himself from being associated with such a dangerous lunatic. However, if this was a lie concocted later, as it must have been, then Vespasian was party to that lie. After all, by then Josephus had become, in effect, the Flavian's own court historian, in which capacity he unblinkingly recorded his tale. And of course, Vespasian himself had to have been aware of the true nature of his own miraculous healings. He could not have taken the chance of failing at the Temple of Serapis, so he must have been pre-assured of success, which required a considerable degree of religious and political cynicism. According to Mark's Gospel, Jesus cured a blind man by spitting into his eyes and healed a crippled man by laying his hands upon him. In the Gospel of John, Jesus cured a blind man by mixing his spittle with some earth and applying it to the blind man's eyes. Both the saliva of Jesus and the saliva of Vespasian are reported to have cured the blind. Likewise, the touch of both are said to have restored the lame. And both Jesus and Vespasian were regarded as Jewish messiahs by their respective devotees. According to Flavius Josephus, Vespasian was the Jewish Messiah. And here I'm quoting from Josephus. But now, what did the most elevate them, the Jews, in undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, how about that time one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth. The Jews took this prediction to belong to themselves in particular, and many of the wise men were thereby deceived in their determination. Now, this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea. However, it is not possible for men to avoid fate, although they see it beforehand. But these men interpreted some of these signals according to their own pleasure, and some of them they utterly despised, until their madness was demonstrated, both by the taking of their city and their own destruction. The 2nd century Roman historian Suetonius agreed completely, as does his contemporary Tacitus, who wrote, "The majority of the Jews were convinced that the ancient scriptures of their priests alluded to the present as the very time when the Orient would triumph, and from Judea would go forth men destined to rule the world." This mysterious prophecy really referred to Vespasian and Titus, his son. But the common people, true to the selfish ambitions of mankind, thought that this exalted destiny was reserved for them, and not even their calamities opened their eyes to the truth. So we have 3 famous Roman historians, all claiming that Vespasian was the Jewish Messiah. Jewish prophecies of a coming Messiah were a fundamental motivation behind the Jewish revolt. And yet, as it turned out, the Emperor Vespasian, along with his son Titus, fulfilled the messianic prophecy of the Christ predicted by Hebrew Scripture, according to both contemporary Roman and Jewish sources. And keep in mind, Josephus was a Jew, and then he defected to the Romans. But even the Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, a father of modern rabbinic Judaism, really the father of modern rabbinic Judaism, declared at the time that Vespasian was the Messiah of Hebrew prophecy according to the Talmud. It is doubtful that the famous rabbi was sincere, and this is likely to have been required of him by the Roman state. However, like Jesus, Vespasian could claim both Gentiles and Jews among those who, at least formally, believed he was the Messiah of Hebrew prophecy. For his part, the Jewish historian Josephus finds the idea of the Messiah to be both the cause and the cure of the Jewish revolt. Like Christianity, he too converts their politically explosive concept of the Messiah into a pro-Roman one, in his case by simply naming Vespasian himself the Messiah. Because they were reported by both Tacitus and Suetonius, we know that Vespasian's healing miracles at Alexandria were a propaganda coup for the Flavian imperial cult. Their coins inform us that both Vespasian and his son Titus celebrated Serapis and associated themselves with that deity. Here is an example with Titus on one side and the bearded god Serapis on the other. And I must admit again, Serapis looks a fair amount like Jesus. And obviously, Titus and Vespasian were aware of Serapis, and so they used Serapis as an example for their syncretic creation of Jesus, which was even a bigger synthesis because it synthesized many, many, many different mythological uh, characters of heroes and God, sons of God, in along with the Jewish history into their story, along with a good deal of secular history and um, astrology, numerology, magic, shamanism. All of it's in there. The New Testament is pretty much like a grab bag of spiritual, thought from it. It was intended to be the new universal religion. I mean, first it was intended to mollify the Jews, but the larger purpose was to ultimately become a universal religion. That the word for universal is Catholic. Okay, so many students of ancient history have observed the numerous elements of Christianity that are apparently pagan in origin, but the wider questions that this observation implies have largely gone unanswered. Why were those elements introduced at all? And more, how could those pagan elements, especially the idea of worshiping a man god born of a mortal, be interwoven into a religion born of a fiercely monotheistic faith? In light of the purity laws Jews then practiced, whether at the temple or within groups like the Qumran sectarians or the suicidally violent rebels of the first and second centuries, how could a pious sect of Jews so modify their faith as to centrally feature the worship of a man who had walked the earth in the flesh? Jews were willing to fight the mighty Roman war machine and to die and be tortured in vast numbers, precisely in order to protect their strictly monotheistic tradition from foreign pollution and the blasphemy of emperor worship. At such a time, when so many were willing to commit mass suicide rather than submit to foreign domination, we are hard pressed to explain how a form of Judaism could actually blend the most objectionable elements of paganism they were fighting into the very heart of its identity, the worship of a man god who had suffered, died, and was resurrected during his earthly life like a pagan, suffering Savior God. And add to that the religious use of graven images, forbidden representations of the divine, a form of idol worship that even quoted the pagan symbols of a Roman emperor. While Pauline Christians in the first century rejected kosher dietary restrictions, circumcision, and the like, the most revolutionary aspects of their Christianity are the identification of the Messiah with God Himself and the use of divine symbols as early as the first decades of the second century. And the symbols they were using were far more than abstract personifications of divine features like wisdom, something already underway within Jewish thought that was the worship and depiction of man as God, of a man as God. A philosophical merging of Judaism with Platonism and Stoicism is readily understandable as a natural outgrowth of Judaism and was a project that was already underway by such philosophers as Philo, as we will see. The sweeping scope of such sudden changes to Judaism in the earliest Christian tradition, however, is something far harder to account for. In addition, we should expect to find this ideological blending within the more moderate or overtly pro Roman elements of Judaism rather than among Orthodox messianics or strict adherents of the Torah. If indeed emperor worship itself was one of their chief grievances with Rome, then any group of contemporary Messianic Jews embracing man god worship is inexplicable. Apart from the emerging picture of an imperial Roman origin for Christianity, the simultaneous introduction of all these radical Rome centric innovations requires a much better explanation than has ever been offered. And I must agree. Um, Throughout the Gospels, never once does Jesus do anything against the Romans, where he is constantly doing things against the Jews. And the same can be said for Paul. Throughout all of the Pauline epistles and the book of Acts, Paul never does anything against the Romans, but he's constantly harping on the Jews and the Jewish traditions and rituals. So, you know, there's just so many red flags that, okay, maybe Christianity can survive those red flags, but those questions aren't even being asked. Christians will not even go there. They will just they will be like libtards, like liberals, who have a emotional response to you. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Oh, and they'll start attacking you ad hominem. They'll start making personal attacks on you. They'll tell you that you're filled with Satan. They'll tell you that you're possessed by a demon. You know, these are the defense mechanisms that supposedly rational Christians are going to be using on you if you even bring this stuff up. But again, the truth is the highest value. And if your faith is strong enough, you should be able to take a look at these texts. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking for you to check it out for yourself and see if you can come up with a better explanation than that the Romans did it all. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there for the day. And please like, share, subscribe, and comment, and contribute. And come back again for tomorrow's episode. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.